Just want to read some background. The first thing I'm going to point out is Sandy McReynolds is an important person here, but she tells me she's backup tonight. She's the tech person. But Sandy, in her own right, just got appointed as the Greenwich Town Historian and is also in charge of the Guild Room at the Greenwich Library. So we welcome Sandy. Just a little bit about her. She was appointed this year as historian. As I've said, she is the regent of the Willard Mountain chapter of the Daughters of American Revolution, involved in several other historical organizations, and is often seen driving around Washington County with her sister Joanne and niece Jessie, a spoiled black lab. And they look for interesting barns to photograph and turtles to rescue. Is that a turtle rescuer? No, that's an interesting hobby.
Come on, help them across the road.
Yeah. You say get along? Our main speaker tonight, of course, is going to be Debbie Craig, who seems to be busy every night of the week in traveling back and forth across the country to really interesting places. She's a lifelong resident of the county, out of Hebron. Was past president of the Washington County Historical Society. She still serves on the executive board. She's been working to save the Anthony House in Battenville since 2006. She is currently president of the Northeast Historical Project in Greenwich, which preserves the history of the Underground Railroad. In addition, Debbie works to preserve the history of the former residents, such as President Chester A. Arthur and Susan Brownell Anthony, our topic for tonight. She is also on the board of the Hebron Preservation Society and the Greenwich Eastern Historical Association, and is the fifth generation of her family to live in the family home. She is what's known as a native. You have to be here for 100 years before you're a native. So without further ado, Debbie.
And what Al didn't know is that since the passing of my uncle in November, I'm now the Hebron historian. So at any rate, we're delighted to be here tonight, and we're so glad you came out. Susan has been an interest of mine since I was probably 7 or 8 years old. Some of you knew my dad. He was constantly spouting history at us as we were growing up. And one of the things he always talked about as we were driving from Hebron to Greenwich was, you see that house, don't you ever forget Susan B. Anthony lived there. She's the reason you can vote. And he would go on and talk about Susan B. Anthony. So this got to be a joke between us, and every time we went through, he would remind me. In fact, not too far from the end of his life, we were talking about Susan, and he said, by any chance is the reason you're working to save that house because of all the talking I did to you about Susan when you were young? And I said, well, Dad, what do you think? And so anyway, but he was a lot of the reason that I was interested in saving the house and interested in her history, because how fortunate that she was right here. I mean, a lot of people don't even know that she lived here for 19 years. She wasn't just here for a few months. And this is one of her famous quotes. I'll let you read it yourselves. This is Susan's birthplace. It's in West Grove near Adams, Massachusetts. She was born there on February 15th, 1820. So in case you hadn't realized it, this is her 200th birthday this year.
They're having big celebrations this year.
Yes, all year.
Yeah.
If you go on the birthplace website, they have all kinds of stuff going on. Unfortunately, I think it's all being kind of tempered by what's going on. Right now, we'll hope that it passes relatively quickly. It's really hard when you've been preparing a celebration for months and years, and then all of a sudden something happens like this that nobody has any control over. This particular house is on a back road. A friend of mine and I drove over there when this house was for sale before it became the museum, and in fact this picture was taken before it became the museum. It's also on a bad curve. Have any of you been over there? Anyway, it's on a bad curb. Now there is a nice parking area on that side of the house and one over here on this side, and it's much more accessible. But that house became a museum probably within 2 or 3 years of when it was acquired. It was purchased by a group called Feminists for Life out of Rochester, and they're a pro-life group, and they don't really use the museum for their platform. They have information in the gift shop about the fact that they're a pro-life group, but the museum itself is about her childhood and her being born in Adams. When she was 6, the family moved across state lines to upstate New York, as you know, because her father had accepted a new job running a mill. And most of you know that if you drive through Battenville and blink, you're not going to see it. So it's a very small community, but there's a veritable history book of the Anthony family within that half-a-mile strip of road. Tonight, we're not much more than a stone's throw from the unassuming settlement in the town of Greenwich, as you know, where the Anthonys moved with their young family. The community was named for the Batten Kill, which flows through the valley. The hamlet is so tiny, as I said before, that most people drive through it before they even realize it. And this picture on the right was taken on a nice foggy morning. So it was here in Battenville that suffragist Susan B. Anthony spent much of her childhood and young adult life. It was here right on the Battenkill where the seeds were planted in her mind of how unfair was the treatment of women. And Sandy found a picture of the settlement from the old map. Do you remember what year that was? Was it the 18...
You're making me blank now.
Sorry. I think it might be
It was the one that was in the
big blue book.
The 1876, 78 one. That it was all the compilation of all the Washington.
Okay. So it's not the earliest one, but it's one of the early ones. A former owner of the house did place a sign identifying the house as her childhood home, so there is no official marker on it at this point, although we did apply this year to have a Pomeroy marker put up, if you're familiar with the Pomeroy Foundation, and we're waiting to hear whether we're going to get it, but it has been designated as one of the places that she was greatly involved, so we're pleased about that. And there is a website you can go to, and you'll find the house, the cemetery across the river, and the schoolhouse that's right across the road from it, and they're all featured in this list. The DAR set a plaque in the marble retaining wall in front of the house in the early 1900s, but as most of you know, because of the fast-moving traffic on Route 29, you risk life and limb to try to read it. And I know that because I did one day, and we had a photographer down there from the Times-Union, and he was kneeling, and since I know you know Route 29, the shoulder is about this wide. He was between the marble retaining wall and the painted line when an 18-wheeler came through. And I truly thought when the truck was gone that I was not even going to see him because it was really scary. But at any rate, it's a really nice sign. If you have a chance to see it from across the road, it's probably a better bet than to try to kneel down in front of it.
It was a very nice article on the Times-Union.
Thank you. We have Wendy Liberator to thank for that. She's Cliff Oliver's wife. Mm-hmm. She used to be a dance reporter for the Schenectady Gazette, and she's now working for the Times-Union. And we also need to thank Greta Hochsprung from the Post-Star. She did the article on the suffrage calendar. Greta is a Washington County girl, and both of them are working to help us save this house. So I'm really pleased about that.
And that was his mill? That's the mill?
This is a portion of the mill. The actual mill that he worked at burned in the 1870s. So what they did was they took a lot of the bricks and reused them. The fellow who owned it passed away a number of years ago. His son started to knock the mill down probably 7 or 8 years ago. It's a brown site. And there was a lot of stuff inside the mill that started to be removed in the middle of the night. That's all I know. My neighbor, my friend that lived up on the hill, just past the Anthony house toward Greenwich, would hear the trucks coming in and out in the night.
What was in that mill? Was
It was a paper mill. It was the biotech.
Okay.
And there were a lot of chemicals stored in the mill once the mill was vacated, the chemicals were left behind. And so it has never been knocked down completely.
No.
It looks pretty much like this. And this was that same foggy morning that I took the picture of the river. So I apologize that it's not a better picture of the mill itself. There's a better picture. That was before he started to knock it down. Judge McLean, whose first name was John, owned a cotton mill on McKill. He'd heard about young Daniel Anthony's success in the textile industry in Adams. That's how Daniel ended up coming over here to Washington County. It was more than 40 miles away, and it's funny, when you think about it, it seems like it should be further away than that, but it really isn't. He hired him to run the mill on McKill, and the Anthonys left Adams for Battenville in 1826. Susan was 6 years old at that point. In the beginning, it's believed that they lived with the judge in his spacious 22-room house for a period of time. And Susan became friendly with the judge's grandson, whose name was Aaron. Over the years, the two of them had many lively conversations on politics and human rights. So a lot of Susan's feelings were planted right here, not after she moved to Rochester. She already was thinking about all the things that were wrong with the way women were treated. This is the front entrance to that house, and some of you may recognize it because it was actually used in the movie The Horse Whisperer a number of years ago. The porch to the right of that. Now, on the right-hand side, there is a stencil. It says CMCL, and that was on a packing crate that was sent to the mill probably in the early 1800s. And they actually lined the storeroom walls with the wood from the packing crates. So, and that's still there to this day. It's pretty cool to go in there. There's two fellows that own that house right now, Gerald Kogel and Bob Nunnally. They're both in their 80s. They just put the Red Tavern across the street up for sale about maybe 6 or 8 months ago. And we're hoping, we're not supposed to know this, but possibly that is going to be acquired to go with the Anthony property. So,
Who would acquire it?
the Office of Parks.
Oh, okay, great.
That's,
Yeah.
I mean, that's not definite at this point, but it's pretty definite. Another view of the house. There used to be slave quarters on this house many years ago. They were off on this side, and that would be on the side toward Salem. Eventually it was torn down, numbered, and moved across the road, and eventually it burned to the ground. But one of the things that happened when they first moved there was Susan and her siblings were afraid because they'd never seen a black person before, which is interesting because she became such an abolitionist as she got older. And let's see. This is a house that the Anthonys lived in for a short time. It's no longer there. That one's been torn down. But there were a number of houses. As you look to the right, as you head towards Salem, there are still a couple of the salt boxes down there and the other houses that the workers lived in. This was another one that was down in there that the Anthonys lived in for a short time. This is a sample of her dad's handwriting when he was running the mill. You can, later on if you want me to go back to this so you can take a look at it. It talks about how much oil he consumes, how much wood and coal. So it's just basically a document of what they did with the mill. Value of articles used in your manufacture was $400, so it's pretty amazing the difference in cost back then. And this was in 1831, so it's almost 200 years ago. The Anthony house itself was built after the Anthonys moved here. The bricks were cast right on site and baked right on site. And Mrs. Anthony, Lucy Reed Anthony, and the girls prepared the meals for all the workers, and they just kind of camped out there while they were working on building the house. The house is much fancier now than it would have been when the Anthonys lived there. All the trim around the roof has been added, most of it in the 1870s when the Hobby family lived there. The Hobbies owned the mill after the McLeans. And as you come west, the end of the house that has that kind of funky little porch, that was added. The porch on the other end was there, but the decoration has been added to it. So that's all considered updating, and that would be probably eventually removed if they do restore the house.
Excuse me,
Sure.
but to cast your own bricks was a very costly and time-consuming. I mean, they weren't in a hurry back then like we are today.
No, not at all.
But it's still,
And Daniel Anthony wasn't hurting financially when they moved to,
apparently.
yeah, Battenville. Unfortunately, because of the collapse in 1839, they lost everything, and that's when they
Oh,
could no longer afford to keep the house.
See.
Inside the house, again, this staircase may have been there, but all the ornate stuff on it wouldn't have been. This item behind the railing is called a coffin niche. The purpose of it was when they were bringing the coffin downstairs to be able to keep it level to turn on the curve on the staircase. They put the corner, they put the corner of the coffin into that niche and turn it so they could keep it level, bringing it down the stairs. So it's amazing the little bits of trivia you learn when you're doing this kind of research.
Wow.
This is a coffin door. It's on the porch that is on the west side of the house. There's a little porch there that's about as wide as this table. And that door is about maybe 2.5 feet tall, just big enough to slide a coffin out. And the purpose was to put it out where it was cooler at night.
Oh.
And then they bring it back in. And this is actually the front hallway of the house, so if you look at the house, that big green door that's right in the middle of the front of the house is right here. So that door is to the left of it, and now they have a slide bolt on it. You can kind of see it up near the bottom of the window, but when they would have been using it when the Anthonys were there, it would have just had knobs on it. And again, you can see, of course, electricity has been added to the house. Some of this woodwork might have been original, but the decorative stuff on the top that you'll see later on was added. And again, now this is the way it looks now. These were taken within the last year to year and a half. The paint is beginning to really peel off, and it's just kind of falling apart because nothing's been happening with it.
You got your work cut out for you.
Well, somebody does. And again, you can see where they pulled away some of the plaster. The house was uninhabited in the 1970s for about 10 or 12 years. My dad was a real estate broker. He had the house for sale, and he used to regale us with stories of what was happening in the house. And again, because he had been drilling me on Susan B. Anthony's history, he'd come home and he'd say, you know, there's a fungus growing in the middle of the dining room floor. It's about this big around, and if you touch it, there's water pouring out of it. And he wasn't really kidding, because the floors all had to be replaced when the new family purchased the house. They lived there for 10 or 12 years, and then they sold the house on eBay.
Wow.
And the fellow who lost it back in 2006 had purchased it on eBay. He lived in San Diego. He worked for the Postal Service, and his plan was to move here when he retired and have a nice little tea room and have the house open to the public so that people could come in and see it, and it just didn't work out for him. It was too hard for him to be that far away and trying to maintain the house. Nice guy though, I felt sorry for him. So this is across the river, and the sign is relatively new. That was put up around the time that the young man did his Eagle Scout project. I was talking to somebody about that earlier. A lot of the Anthony family is buried in this cemetery, and if you know Battenville at all, as you go toward Greenwich, if you turn left on Route 61, it's about a half a mile from the intersection. You go through the bridge, straight up the hill like you're going over the hill to the Burger Den, and this will be on your right. There's a little building right across the road that you're going to see in just a minute in one of the pictures, and that was the school that she attended. She didn't teach there, but she did attend there, and I'll talk to you more about that in a minute. So these are Susan's maternal grandparents. These would be her mom's parents, Lucy, Susanna, and both of them died in their, I believe, 83rd year, within a year of each other. and Daniel. Daniel was a soldier in the Revolutionary War. I found out lots of interesting things about him, like what battles he fought in. One of the battles he fought in was in a place called Stone Arabia. I had never heard of it. And this past fall, one of my cousins passed away, and his funeral was out in, I think it was Pine Plains. It's not Pine Plains.
Palatine Bridge.
No, it's past Palatine
Oh.
Bridge.
For Plain.
In that area.
Yeah.
That's not the right name, but at any rate, as I was driving out there, I see this sign that says Stone Arabia, and I said, I don't have to be at the funeral for an hour and a half. I'm going exploring.
Yeah.
So I found the battlefield, what's left of it, and got a chance to see where he would have actually fought. It's like by driving off that, I think it was Route 5,
Yeah.
by driving off Route 5, all of a sudden you're in a part of the whole area that time just kind of forgot.
Amish settlements too. There's
Yeah, a
Amish,
lot of them,
huge
and
Amish
there's
people.
some really cool fieldstone houses and churches
Yeah,
back in there.
beautiful.
It's worth the drive. It's
Yeah.
only maybe 5 minutes off Route 5. If you're ever in Palatine Bridge getting off the throughway, just take a drive out there. It's really interesting to see. So they are buried, as you face the cemetery, there's a couple of big trees as you can see, and they're just to the, I think that would be north. Wait, trying to think, going toward the house. Somebody that's good with directions, can you help me out?
Well, the cemetery's on the south side of the road.
Okay,
So as you face the cemetery, I'm sorry, the Batten Kills on your right,
okay,
which would be west.
okay, thank you. And there's another shot,
You're facing the south.
okay,
Facing south. And the Batten Kills off to the side.
okay, thank you. That's another shot of Susanna and Daniel's stones. You can see them a little bit more clearly there. And I always thought that the fenced-in area was probably going to be part of the Anthony's plot, but it's not. It's another family. And there are quite a few McLeans buried in here as well, from that family that owned the mill.
Wait a minute. I thought that the fenced-in area was a relative of Susan's, that she came back and had that headstone placed there.
No, that's the big memorial at the other end.
All right,
She put that up in memory of her grandfather. You're going to see it in just a few minutes.
sorry.
No, that's okay. Because I kept looking at those graves thinking, there's got to be a connection, and they're not that I could find. If anybody can, I'd be more than willing to add it to what we're talking about. This is her sister Eliza's gravestone. Eliza was 2.5 when she died, and we found out about her, but we didn't know where she was buried. So another historian and I set out looking for her. And we walked the Easton Friends Meeting House graveyard. We walked all over the Battenville graveyard. We walked all over the Greenwich graveyard. We could not find Eliza Anthony anywhere. And we just happened to be talking to the two fellows who live in the big white house and mentioned we were looking for her, and they said, we have a gravestone in the backyard with plants on it. We don't know who it belongs to. We can go look. And so out back we went, and they flipped it over, and we saw Eliza, daughter of, and then they flipped over the bottom, and it said Lucy and Daniel Anthony. So that was pretty cool.
Do you know what she died of?
I believe it was scarlet fever.
Oh, yeah.
And in one of the books that talked about Susan's mother years later, it said that when she passed, they found amongst her belongings a pink baby dress that was covered with tear stains. So she kept the baby's dress all those years. This is Joe Ferranini. He is one of the volunteers, and I believe right now he's the president of the Knickerbocker Mansion Association, and he does gravestone repairs. And if you ever need anybody, he does an amazing job. You can read it a little bit better now. It says Eliza across the top. He did clean the stone for us, and the DAR paid for the repairs. We put an article in the paper, and quite a number of people donated, and that's how we were able to do it. She was 2 years and 24 days, and I'm looking to see, it was 1834 that she passed.
No, is that in that graveyard, like nearby it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and what we did was, because we could not find exactly where she was,
Right.
we figured common sense would tell you that if a child was buried in the graveyard and her grandparents were already there, that probably they would put her in close proximity.
Yeah.
So we placed her stone, the grandparents' stones are right here. So they're very close. So we were not able to find out the exact location, but at least she's in the same
Right.
general area. Now, interestingly, if you were to go to the cemetery in Rochester where Susan's buried and most of her siblings, on the back of one of the stones it tells you who's in Battenville.
Oh.
It's very cool. So if you're ever out there, the cemetery is not very far off. I believe it's exit 46 on the thruway. You just head toward Rochester and the cemetery is on the left. There's signs everywhere to tell you how to get to Susan's grave, how to get to Frederick Douglass's grave, and they're all quite close together.
Is that the Mount Hope Cemetery?
Yes, Mount Hope. Yep. And if you're ever out there, it's worth the stop. It's really interesting. And there's a large Anthony plot. There must be probably 15 to 20 graves in it, because by the time you get the siblings and their spouses and their children, and there's a good number of people. So about 10 years ago or so, there was a young man from Saratoga who decided he was going to do an Eagle Scout project. I actually bumped into his mother at a brunch honoring Susan B. Anthony on her birthday at the Gideon Putnam in Saratoga. And his mom was really involved with the League of Women Voters. So we started talking, and she said, oh, my son is looking for an Eagle Scout project. I don't know what he could do. And I said, I do. We have a cemetery. So I told her about it, and of course, being in League of Women Voters, she said, Susan B. Anthony, are you kidding? He's there. He will do this job whether he wants to or not. I want him to. So she came, and they all came. They did a wonderful job. And he brought a crew of boys and girls from Saratoga High School. They cleaned up the cemetery. They mapped it. He had a math teacher with him that helped him set up a grid and put all the graves in that they could locate. And at the end of the day, he was standing with one of his friends, and he said to me, what are these dips in the ground? I'm just curious, what are these dips? I said, I don't know. He said, well, I'm going to find out. And he started to dig with his hands. So he unearthed a gravestone that happened to say Anthony McLean. So I did a little checking into it, and Anthony McLean is the son of Guelma, Susan's older sister, Anthony McLean, who married Aaron McLean that I mentioned before. They had all the conversations with Susan. And Susan, by the way, happened to be in love with. But when she went away to teach someplace else, her sister kind of moved in and ended up marrying Susan's love. But this gravestone was in 3 pieces when we found it, and again, Joe Peronini repaired it. This is the headstone, and we also found in the same proximity the footstone. And we repaired it and replaced it exactly where it was. So we're assuming that that is his actual grave. And neither of his parents are buried there. They're both buried in Rochester. He's probably, if you face the cemetery, he's closer to the Battenville cemetery sign
How old
than the
was
rest of the family.
he?
He-
8 years? 16?
No, he was 1 year and 16
Oh.
days, I believe.
A baby.
Yeah, they were both babies. This is the house that the sister and her husband lived in. So that house was built after the brick house. And that house is in a really sad state of affairs right now. So he purchased it, and he invited us to go in. So there's a door over here that's kind of all rotted. The window upstairs is all rotted, and the door downstairs is all rotted, and it's caved in. And it's been that way for a long time. But he wanted us to go in. So we looked in the door, and the floors are going like this toward the middle of the house. And I thought, I don't particularly want to walk in on that floor, but he went in first, and he walked around the edge, and I thought, okay, that looks all right. So we all kind of hitched around the edge, and then he got to the living room, which is over in that corner, and the floor was intact. And so he started to walk across the floor, and the whole floor torqued, and it went like this. We thought he was going right to the basement. It was fortunately tongue and groove, so when it did that, it was still held together, but I'm not quite sure how. But the funny thing is, once we got around to that far east end of the house, there was a beam, and you could walk along the beam to the staircase, which is right kind of in the middle, and it's that way from the chimney that you can see right up there on the peak. The upstairs is perfectly sound because they repaired the roof back in the 70s. There's not a rotted board anywhere upstairs.
That's nice.
It's amazing. The floors are sound. One thing that was a little strange is there were some photos taken by somebody that was with us that day, and there's a number of orbs in the photos.
There's a number of what?
Orbs. Like ghostly orbs.
Yeah.
Like light orbs just there. We didn't see anything. I didn't see anything. That's not really my thing, but this one set of photographs had a lot of orbs in it.
Has anybody said that these places light up at night, or?
No, I have never seen anything. I go by there all the time, but
No.
that doesn't mean they don't.
Right, and I've never heard that these places are haunted either.
No.
David Pitkin has in his book that she stands at the window and cries about her.
Oh, I'm in the book. Yeah, I was there with him. Yeah, he took a picture looking down the stairs on that circular staircase, and he has a shadow of her dress. And I'm not saying it does or doesn't exist.
I think for the sake of science, you ought to go in one night and just see if you can see.
Yeah.
All right, Bob, I'll go if you will.
There you go.
We'll bring Carolyn,
Yeah,
and, you know, make it a party.
A little picnic.
So there he is with the little boy's gravestone repaired. And the grave is about this long. It's tiny, tiny. It's very sad. Let's see, what have I left out? Oh, the boy's name was Patrick Garrett that did all the repair work.
The Cub Scout.
Yes, the Eagle Scout. Eagle Scout. This is the schoolhouse across the road. This is two different paint jobs. This is the current paint job, and that is the previous paint job. That was the Battenville School. It's in the town of Jackson.
No, schoolhouse number 3 in Jackson.
Thank you, Sharon. Sharon used to be the Jackson historian. And some of you may know Bill Krattinger. He climbed underneath the schoolhouse and dated it from the bottom up. And he confirmed that the schoolhouse was built prior to 1820. So I don't know exactly what he did, but he said he could verify that it was built.
Is
in that
it
time
open
period.
as a museum or someone living there?
Somebody lives there.
Oh, I see.
Now, the cool thing is, we're going to be doing, if this coronavirus thing winds down, we are doing a bus tour of the sites that were directly involved with Susan B. Anthony on May 31st. And this is going to be one of the stops with, and by the way, the cemetery's right here across the road. It couldn't be much closer. I have permission from the owners of the house for us to go in if there's time. So if you're interested, there's information on the table. I'd be glad to talk to you about it after the presentation. It was owned by a family named Clay that I used to teach in Cambridge. When I was teaching in Cambridge, the parents owned the house. And in this front part, that's the living room, the chalkboards are still there.
Dana still lives in it.
Yes, Dana
Dana
still
bought
lives
it
there.
with Mom and
Well,
Dad.
Dana's the one that gave me permission to bring everybody in.
Yeah,
so.
Dana still lives there.
Yep, and Dana was my student, as was her sister and her other sister.
It was her babysitter.
That I didn't know. So this is inside.
Oh,
And they obviously sell maple syrup.
yeah.
And I told her she would be welcome to sell it that day if she wanted to. Now this is the way the Anthony house looked after the Anthonys would have left. You can see the decorations have been added. And another family that owned the mill named Haskins did more updating. The building on this side that's no longer there, the top part was the schoolhouse where Daniel Anthony, after he pulled his kids out of public school, he started his own school upstairs in his own house. And then the underneath part was like for storage and for putting carriages and so forth in. That was torn off in, I believe, the 1960s, and they built a mother-in-law apartment that stands there today. And it's not in very good shape. It's starting to kind of crumble in a number of places. If you walk anywhere around the house, you can see.
Are you going to share why he pulled the kids out of
Yes, I am going to share why he pulled the kids out. So backing up a little bit, because I forgot to mention this is really important. Susan, when she was attending this school, wanted to learn how to do long division. So she mentioned that to the teacher, and the teacher said, girls don't need to know how to do long division. You need to know how to do needlework. Well, Susan didn't want to learn how to do needlework, so she pretended to be cold, and she went over and stood by the stove, and she learned to do long division. So then she went home, and she told her father what had happened, and her father was just a tad angry, and he pulled the kids out of school and started his own school. And he not only educated his own children, he educated the mill workers. They were taught to read as well as his own kids.
Was the teacher a woman at that time?
I don't know the answer to that. Sometimes they were women and sometimes they were men.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about, Susan, is compared to the men
Right.
just a little
Right.
bit.
So
When she started teaching.
So she picked up on early condescension.
Oh, very quickly. Very quickly, because she was probably at that point, well, they had just moved there, so I figure she was 6 or 7. So, and she knew it wasn't right. In her mind, anyway.
From any information I had, there was a male teacher at that school.
At that point, yeah. Now, interestingly, if you look at the yard, you can see how much the yard has been raised now and how much lower the road is.
Yeah.
I think, 1833, this was taken in 1897. So it's a little over 100 years ago, about 123 years ago. This is the inside of that room that I was mentioning to you that was the schoolhouse. And again, as it says, it was torn down in 1990. This is the top, well actually that's the bottom floor of the mother-in-law apartment, and this is the dining room of the main house, the way it looks now. And again, all this decoration was added later on. Oops. This is Hiram Corliss. He was a buddy of Daniel Anthony. He was also a physician in Greenwich. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He was the founder of the American Medical Association. He was quite a guy. He had a son who designed, I believe, was it a steam engine, Claudia? Do you remember the big?
Steam engine.
Thank you, Sandy.
And his other son, one of his other sons, did the spherical safe.
Yeah, and it was for the World's Fair in
steam engine.
Chicago. Was it Chicago?
Philadelphia.
Okay. I don't remember the year. It was around 1878, somewhere in there. Anyway, Corliss lived in the village of Greenwich. As you're headed out toward Cambridge and you cross the bridge, right before you cross the bridge, there's a little ranch house that stands there now. His mansion was there. And it was probably 16 rooms. The legend is there was a hidden room in the basement where he would hide runaways. And he and Daniel Anthony were business partners for a time. There's no evidence that the Anthonys hid any runaways in Battenville, but because of their connection with him, they could have. And Corliss was also a founder of the Free Congregational Church, which stood to the left of Allen Brown's real estate office. And for anybody who's not familiar with it, it was a church that was formed by 12 or 13 families from Greenwich who felt that the churches in town weren't strong enough against slavery. So they started their own church. They all kicked in like $500, which back then was a lot of money. And they established the church. And it stayed open as a church through the Civil War. And then after that, it closed, and eventually it became a theater. It burned down. And then it became a bowling alley. It burned down, and then I think they filled it in.
Not quite. It didn't burn down until
The 60s.
after it was 1913. But at that point, they already had bowling downstairs.
Downstairs,
Yeah.
right. And then that burned in the 60s?
That burned 1913. That building.
The bowling alley burned in 1913?
Well, the bowling alley still existed.
Okay,
They built
that's
the-
what I thought.
They built a little weird half round circle for their roof, and they made it so you still had access to the stairs to go into the bowling alley.
Okay, yeah, I
And
never
then they
saw
closed
that.
that, and it was raised finally like in the late 50s, early 60s.
Okay, that's what I thought I remember hearing.
Was that candlepin bowling? or was it regular bowling?
Boy, I don't know the
I have no
answer to
idea.
that.
I've never heard any difference. It was just.
I mean,
bowling.
Candlepin is the little tiny,
What they do in New England.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right,
I think it was
and
standard.
tiny bowl, tiny.
three
Yeah.
balls, you get 3 tries instead
Yeah.
of 2.
Yeah, I always did much better at Candlepin than I did regular bowling. So anyway, I started to tell you that Daniel Anthony and Hiram Corliss had a little business together. They had a lumbering and logging business, nothing to do with, the medical field or anything like that. And apparently they used to run logs down the Battenkill at one point. And there is a spot in the house that would appear to be a hiding place. In the front hallway, there's a little narrow hallway that's about the width of a door. And there's a closet on each side of it. And if you step into the closet that's the closest to Route 29, there's an area where you can actually step in and then step kind of almost into the wall so that you can't be seen. Or even if somebody reached in, they wouldn't be able to feel you there. So there's some speculation as to whether that was possibly a hiding place. And the other thing is, in that same hallway, there's about this much space between the ceiling of the hallway and the ceiling of the actual closet. There's enough space so somebody could hide up in there. It's hard to know whether that was changed after the Anthonys were there or before. So we don't know if that's really true or not. There's Dr. Corliss's mansion. It was there until the 1960s. I actually spoke with a gentleman who, as far as I know, is still living in Virginia. He grew up in the house. His grandparents owned it. And he told me some amazing stories. In fact, he told me that down beyond the rivers over here, down behind the house, that there was an area where the yard had caved in, and he believed that that was where the tunnels had been that went down to the river. And supposedly, there was a way to get the runaways from the basement down to the river through the tunnels. Then they'd go across the river. Originally, somebody told me they went underneath the river. I don't think so. I don't think that would be feasible. But I was told later that they went by rowboat across the river and then up the hill to the home of a man named Merritt Green. And that house is still there. If you're going out of Greenwich toward Cambridge, there's a house that has artificial brick on the front of it. That's the Merritt Greenhouse. And Merritt Green Jr., when he was a child, used to come downstairs in the morning, and sometimes his mother would say to him, "You have to be very quiet, we have guests in the house today." And there would be runaways asleep on the floor in front of the fireplace. And he wrote about that when he was an elderly man. He'd retired from Greenwich to Florida. And he wrote an article for the Greenwich Journal. That's how I learned about it. So it was pretty cool. But unfortunately, this house was torn down, like I said before, in the 1960s, and they built that little ranch house there in its place. This home is known as Quainton's House. It's down on Route 40 between Easton, and well, actually it's between Greenwich and Northeastern. It sits way back from the road. There's a circular driveway in front of it. The folks who lived here back in the mid-1800s were friends of the Anthony. They were Quakers. Their names were Job and Esther Wilbur, and they were conductors on the Underground Railroad as well. One night when Daniel Anthony was taking Susan to Philadelphia to attend Miss Molson's school, they got caught in a blizzard and they had to spend the night with the Wilburs in Easton. And one of the things that this house is most known for is the story of a man named Frank Quaintance. Frank was a runaway. One night the Wilburs were just finishing dinner and their grandson came in and said, the neighbors are coming with a package. And that meant that they had a runaway and that they were going to be hiding them. So they spirited him upstairs and he got into the attic. There was one of those square holes in the ceiling and they had a ladder and they got him up into the attic. And no sooner did they get him up there when there was a knock on the door and there were 2 slave catchers looking for this gentleman that was running away. What ended up happening is he had grabbed a knife as he went through the kitchen. Of course, the Wilburs didn't like that because they were pacifists. He had the knife up in the attic. The slave catchers came in. They looked all over. They couldn't find him. And one of them said, "He's not here. Let's go." And the other one said, "What's that ladder for?" And they made them put the ladder up to the hole. They went up, and of course there's the guy with the knife, and he said he wasn't going to be taken alive. So they left to get help. They brought him downstairs, dressed him up in Mrs. Wilbur's clothes, and took him into Greenwich to Hiram Corliss's house, where he hid for several days. And then they took him on the Underground Railroad toward Canada. This driveway now is circular, and this is actually going to be one of the stops on the tour. The hole in the ceiling is, I believe, in this room right here.
Excuse me,
Sure.
but you mean to tell me that before the Civil War, that they could come into your house?
In 1850, they passed a law.
In New York State?
Fugitive slave law was nationwide.
Wow. They could retreat because those were property.
Yeah, it was property.
Right, right.
Even in free state.
Yeah, unfortunately. And for a long time, anyone who made it as far as Greenwich made it. That's just the way it was. But then when the fugitive slave law was passed,
Right.
you know, it was,
Right, that-
it was
that's a
different.
federal
But it was
law.
interesting because in the village of Greenwich, there were a bunch of these people that belonged to the church that I mentioned before. There was one particular man named John T. Masters who owned the TD Bank building.
Mhm.
He was not a slave owner, but he interestingly had slaves, or so everybody thought. And if you checked the census rolls, the names changed all the time because he was just shuttling people through. And nobody ever turned him in. He never got caught.
Right. Well, then he had sympathizers.
He had sympathizers.
But
But it was all the wealthiest people in town. It was the lawyers, the doctors, it was the bankers, it was the people that had money.
But the people who were going after them, going after the slaves, they're lucky they didn't get tarred and feathered, whether it be a federal law or not. But because back then
I'm-
people would do things like that.
I'm sure there were places that they
did
did,
get
but
tarred and feathered.
yeah. So we believe this is the meeting house where Susan attended with her father, because there are two meeting houses. The brick one was built after the Anthonys left. So we don't believe that the meeting that she attended with her dad one January night when it was bitterly cold, she went inside with him. She had begged to go to the meeting. She had a new plaid coat. She wanted everybody to see it, which is funny because you don't think of Susan B. Anthony as being the least bit vain about anything. But so she went in with him, and one of the eldresses noticed that she was in there, and they said, she can't stay, she's not a member. So even though she was a child, she had to go out into the cold by herself. And if you've ever been up on Meeting House Road, even now there's no lights up there. So here she is on this bitterly cold January night outside the building. And so she finally got so cold that she went to a neighbor's house, and the neighbors had a great big dog. And the great big dog jumped on her new coat and ripped it. And it said that she remembered that for the rest of her life. So Daniel, after that evening, said to the members of the meeting house, "Thou will accept my children or we will not be coming here." And so they accepted the children, and eventually they were not all that religious about attending the Quaker meeting house. For one thing, Lucy Anthony was Baptist. Daniel was a Quaker. So this building is also going to be open the day of the tour, so if you've not been in it before, it's interesting. It's a really pretty spot. It sits up on a hill. Back in Battenville, this is the foundation for Daniel Anthony's store. I found this by accident one day a number of years ago. If you cross directly across from the brick house, there's a driveway that goes off to the left, and the road goes this way and the driveway goes down. And there's an old barn down in there, there's a salt box over here, and right tied up against the road is a foundation. Daniel built a store for his workers back in the mid-1800s when they first came here, so that they wouldn't be going to other places and spending their money. The money would stay in Battenville. They couldn't buy liquor there, but they could buy all their other provisions that they needed. Sometime in the 1940s, 1950s, somebody from Falmouth, Massachusetts purchased the store. They numbered it, they dismantled it, they took it to Falmouth, rebuilt it, and opened it as an antique shop, and it's still down there. What I heard, and I have not been able to locate the building, and I even went to Falmouth looking for it, the coffee grinder from Battenville is still in the building. So I thought that was pretty cool. But if you ever have the opportunity to walk down that little road, you'll see the foundations right at the base.
Would that be on the tour?
Hopefully. The biggest problem is the traffic there. But by the way, for those of you that know the road, the Office of Parks is providing police to cross people.
Okay, good.
So they are really trying very hard to work with us, which I am very pleased because it's taken a long time. This is the tavern I mentioned before that may possibly be one of the buildings that's going to be acquired. Part of the reason is because there's parking beyond. There's a carriage house here, which one would think, well, they can just tear that down. It's considered a historic building. They cannot tear it down. So the front of it has been made into a garage, and I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of that, with rolling doors. And there's not a thing that can be done except to restore it. It can't be torn down. This building will be open unless they've sold it to somebody else before May 31st. The whole downstairs is set up like it would have been when it was a hotel. And the original name for this building was the Stoops Hotel. It wasn't just a tavern. There were rooms available upstairs where they probably had 4 or 5 people in a room, and they probably stayed for a few pennies a night. Downstairs, on the left-hand side where the first big black door is the tavern. The bar is still there. They have replaced the plasterwork on the walls. The floor has been replaced, and you step through that door and you feel like you've gone back 200 years. It's incredible. The next door to the right is like the center hallway, and again, it's furnished with period furniture, so again, you feel like you're stepping back in time. And then the door the furthest to the east has like a sitting area, and they have built a Rumford fireplace that looks like it was there from day one, and it wasn't. It's only been there maybe 15 or 20 years, but it looks so in character with the house. It's beautiful, and the guys have done a really nice job with it. For years, Bob not only had an artist studio upstairs, he had the whole upstairs, and he does paint, or did. I don't think he's painting much these days. He did paintings that were 4 or 5 feet long and 4 or 5 feet high. He has works hanging in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, as does his partner Gerald. Both of them have artwork hanging in the Museum of Modern Art in Modern Art in New York. That building was built right around 1800, by the way. This is a copy of Susan's 1843 teacher's license, and it's a little hard to see, but that's where she signed it, right in the middle. This is on Prospect Street in Greenwich. It actually is part of another house now. If you know Greenwich at all, if you go into Greenwich from Salem, on the right, Prospect Street is the first hard right that goes up the hill, and then the road veers to the left. If you go about maybe, what do you think, say half a mile from that intersection? Not even.
that.
Okay.
If you know where the Greenwich School is?
Yeah, you can go the
Yeah.
other way. You can go in on Gray Avenue and then make a right. And where the road tees with Prospect, this is right in front of you. And the part that you can see there was the school. They built on a whole new part of the house over here. But another interesting character lived in that house for a number of years. His name was Kim Gannon, and he wrote the lyrics for I'll Be Home for Christmas. So he lived in that house for a number of years. But Susan would have taught in that actual building that's right in front of you, or that part of the building.
The 2 windows and the white door looking thing?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the door to the left was probably the entrance. I mean, it probably wasn't that specific door, but it was that general area. This is another school that she taught in an area called Vitas Corners. That's North Greenwich. And it's also a private home now. That's a brick schoolhouse. This is not the school, and it looks nothing like this now, by the way, if you're familiar with it. It's the one that's now a bed and breakfast, Airbnb, right on Route 29 on the corner of Ryan Road. This is the way it looked probably 4 or 5 years ago. It looked like it was going to fall down most any day. And Jill Teft and her dad had bought it because her grandfather attended that school. And I think they call it Grandpa's B&B or something like that.
Yeah.
Grandpa's Schoolhouse, I think might be the name of it. So you can see how much it was encroached upon by all the greenery around it, and that's all cleaned it back. There's lawn around it now. This is not the school she taught in, though, because the school that is here was built in like 1853, and they left in 1845. We can't find any other school that was in Hardscrabble, though. And that whole area of Greenwich was called Hardscrabble at the time. Daniel Anthony changed the name to Center Falls. He thought Hardscrabble was too discouraging a name for it. Well, it is. I mean, you know, and any of you that know Washington County know that if you dig down more than 6 inches, you're going to hit shale or chunks of rock. And so farming in Hardscrabble was pretty tough. At any rate, one of the things that happened in the schoolhouse that I thought was particularly interesting, this was one of the tougher schools in the district. And most of the teachers had been men. But this time, young Susan was hired. She was probably 17. She was going to come in at the beginning of the year and teach the farm boys. And they had a pretty good reputation for being tough. One of the things they were known for was taking the schoolmaster by the seat of his pants and throwing him out the door. Well, they weren't going to do that with Miss Anthony because she was a woman. So the first day, she knew about this group of boys that were kind of infamous in the area. And so when they came in, they sauntered in and they sat down, and she invited the biggest one up to the front and proceeded to have him bend over a desk, and she paddled him in front of everybody else, and she never had a bit of trouble. So, she's kind of a gutsy lady. I mean, of course, if you did that now, you'd be arrested. So that's another view of the house that's fairly recent. Within the last few years, you can see how the shutters have started to be blown closed, and the state hasn't really done anything about keeping them open because they don't necessarily want people looking in the windows. This was the home that they lived in after they lost all their belongings in the crash of 1839. They had to sell everything that was in their pantry, the sugar, flour, their eyeglasses, their underwear, everything, and of course their beloved house. This building stood about where the water treatment plant is on Route 29, and it was a 3-story building. The 3rd floor, where you can see the window on the end, was a dance hall. And the youth from around the area asked Daniel Anthony if they could have dances up on the 3rd floor. And he decided that even though he didn't support dancing, that he would allow them to dance up there because then they wouldn't be going to the taverns. So they were allowed to have their dances upstairs. The girls were allowed to attend, but they had to sit along the wall and just watch. They were not allowed to dance. This building was torn down in the 1960s. Hollingsworth and Vose decided it was more of a liability because people were going into it. It was vacant, and it was getting to be a little treacherous in terms of the condition of the floors and so forth. So they did tear it down probably around 1965 or so. I don't know the original name. It was an inn originally, but I don't know what the name of the inn was.
And how long did they live there?
Just a matter of maybe a couple of years. Although it actually had to be, I don't know if they lived in that specific house, but they were here for 6 years after they lost their property. So they were somewhere in the area.
Right.
And you said there was a crash?
Yeah, it was like the crash in 1929, but in 1839.
And it was as bad as that?
It was pretty bad. Yeah, the McLean's lost the mill, Daniel Anthony lost everything. And he had a really tough time starting back up. Now, he tried to run the mill that is Hollingsworth and Vose now. If you look at the mill, I believe the part that is the brick section in the middle is the oldest part, and that would have been what was standing. He also had a small mill that they think was to the left of where the Houstons live, the Gray House. It's a newer house right on the corner as you head towards Salem. I'm trying to think, it's after the road that goes down to the right and across the river at Center Falls.
The original house on the left had 4 fireplaces, because you've got the other 2 chimneys on the left.
And they're gone.
And on the right, those 2 chimneys are gone, so those fireplaces are taken out. And also the 3rd floor window, which is apparent on the left, is boarded up. And I'm guessing it was probably the outhouse on the picture on the left. That's on the back.
Oh, over here?
Yeah, because that's gone over here.
Okay,
And
that
it looks
makes
like
sense.
it was probably a bathroom put in, because you got 2 smaller windows on that right-hand corner.
Yep.
So that would be my guess. That was probably the outhouse. And then you see the road, because that led to the bridge.
Okay.
That was where the bridge originally was in Center Falls. Now where it
Oh,
is
okay,
now.
I did not know that.
Yes, that's where the bridge was along that
Alright.
road and crossed there. But then it got wiped out with floods, so
Floods.
finally they decided to relocate the bridge
And make it higher.
where it is now.
This is at the site of Congregational Academy. This is actually in Congregational. If you know Congregational at all, it's right off Route 10, I think, that goes up into Sharon Springs. There's a big stone school that sits up on the hill, and that marker is right in front of it. This is not the school she taught in. It was on that site though. And that was one of the places, one of the bigger schools that she taught in. It's the way she looked in, it would have been 1848. She gave a rally in Hubbard Hall, and it was on February 8th and 9th. I can't remember the year, but it's in some of my notes somewhere. She also gave a number of rallies in Burton Hall in Easton. This is the marker that I was talking about. This was placed by her in 1905 on her last visit to Battenville. And on one side of it, it talks about the different places that he fought in the Revolutionary War, and then on this side, it honors both her grandfather and her grandmother with their dates.
This gentleman, this Daniel Reed, has quite an impressive background for the battles he fought.
Yes,
Those are major
they were major battles.
battles of the Revolution.
Yeah, I mean, he was an interesting character in his own right without his famous granddaughter.
Exactly.
You know,
exactly.
And not a lot is known about him. I tried to do some research finding out about his activity, like at the Battle of Stone Arabia, and I couldn't find much. There's another view, you can read it a little bit better. Now, the two names at the top are Humphrey Anthony and Hannah Lapham Anthony. There is a connection somehow with Hannah Lapham Anthony and the Laphams that live around this area. This is
The person
Susan's
mowing
Grace.
it now is a volunteer, he's a teenager.
Oh, really? That I didn't know. That's great. Excellent.
Did you know the Anthonys were related to Thomas Jefferson?
That I didn't know. That's very cool.
Yeah.
This is Susan's actual gravestone in Rochester. This is the stone that had the stickers all over it in 2016 when Hillary didn't win.
What do people leave on her grave?
Mostly stones.
Okay.
Mostly stones and flags and flowers. And
Do you think they'd leave I vote buttons or something?
well, that's what
That's
this
what we
thing
do on
was
election day.
covered with.
Yeah.
I vote
Yeah.
stickers. And it's the house pretty much the way it looks now. You can see that a lot of the paint is starting to come off.
Do you have any idea when that marble,
I
Wall?
do, well, it was after 1897 because that was the picture that didn't
Right.
have a wall.
right,
I don't know, Claudia, do we have a, DAR didn't put that up, did they?
No.
They just put the, you
We
can see
didn't
the,
even put that plaque up, that was
Oh, no.
it was the
Cambridge.
Cambridge
on the
chapter,
top,
right, yeah.
Probably came from Dorset or East Dorset.
The marble, you
Marble.
mean? Yeah. I don't know how we'd go about finding out when it was put up. I mean, there might be something to do with the record for the road. I don't know whether they widened it at that point, but you can see that they've cut it back considerably. That section of lawn in front of the house is maybe 10 feet wide, might not even be that wide. And then when you walk around behind it, it's only about 10 to 12 feet from the back of the house to the base of the hill. And you can't really see the hill here, but it's one of the issues with the house. There's a lot of runoff from the hill, the water runs down, it goes into the basement, and as I was telling you, when my dad had the house for sale, one of the things that happened, and I didn't tell you this part, was in the basement, there was a fungus growing out of the walls. And he said if you bumped it, you got soaked, because it was just loaded with water. He said it was disgusting. And apparently that started to grow again, and then the house was full of black mold after this whole time of being vacant, and supposedly they've stabilized that at least somewhat, but that's one of the things that a lot of the money is going for, is to get that drainage system worked out so that there won't be as many issues with the basement and so forth. I know they're still looking for a resident person to live in the house. I don't think they see it as ever being a museum per se, full-time anyway. I would like to see it become something like maybe a women's research library, that a lot of it could be done on the internet and people could access the materials from anywhere in the world. And that's my thought. That way you wouldn't have to have tons of parking places. But at least I feel like Betty Little and Carrie Warner are really stepping up to the plate. Carrie's acquired $250,000 and Betty has acquired $150,000. And the state, the Office of Parks has acquired, I believe, $300,000. That's where the $700,000 came from. And work is supposed to start, if all goes as planned, this spring.
How about you talk a little bit about what she actually accomplished in her life that we celebrate this year?
Good idea. All right, well, one of the things that she obviously accomplished was she was one of the first women to actually vote before women were allowed to vote, and she voted illegally, so her vote didn't count. She was arrested after that. They came right to her house, and if you go to the Rochester house, they'll tell you exactly where she was standing when she was arrested, and they came in to take her away. The funny thing was, she was given a fine, and she said, "I'll never pay it," and she never did. She never gave them a cent. So
Did they put her in jail?
they took her, but I don't think she stayed for any length of time. You know, because there were several people that voted with her. Her sisters voted with her. And it wasn't just her. And of course, she worked with people such as, oh my word, there was Lucy Stone. There were a whole bunch of them that were suffragists, and they were spread out over a long period of time because Susan started working with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was from Johnstown. And Susan did a lot of her work before she even met Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had 5 children. She wasn't exactly free to be out lecturing the way Susan was able to because she wasn't married. So a lot of times Susan would go to visit Elizabeth and she would end up babysitting while Susan wrote the speeches. And then Susan would go and deliver them. So, but she was a pretty amazing woman. My sister and I had the opportunity to go out to Utah this fall. And one of the first things we did was, of course, my sister had been out there already, and she said, "Well, there's a great gift shop in this building over here. It opens at 10 o'clock. Okay, fine." So we sit in front, we wait until it opens up, and we open the doors, and the first thing it says is, "Site of women getting the right to vote in 1870. I thought, this is really cool. Well, then we started looking around. There was a whole big women's suffrage display. Who's right in the middle of it? But Susan B. Anthony, who had taken the train from California with a woman named Dr. Anna Howard Shaw. Some of you may have heard of her. She used to come and give speeches at the Cambridge Fair back in the day. She was from Boston, a very well-educated woman. She had her PhD. She was a pastor, and so she traveled with Susan. They went out there, and the Mormons gave their wives the right to vote before anybody else. And interestingly, they voted as the first territory, and then they were the first state to grant women the right to vote as well. But Susan was right there, and she never got to vote legally, which is the saddest thing.
Because she was arrested. Why? Why?
Because they didn't pass the,
Oh, they already.
you know, she died in 1905, and the Equal Rights, or the Women's Suffrage Act didn't pass until 1920. So 15 years before she died.
Question here. You said that the Mormons, the women were the first to vote. The Mormon women
What's the question?
In Utah.
in Utah. Okay.
Yeah.
I read that Wyoming,
They were the first, they were actually,
first state.
yeah, the reason I brought that up was because they were the first territory and the first state, but you're right, Wyoming was the
Wyoming.
first.
And that's all the way out west. It was pretty much a wild.
Very progressive.
What was it? A wild place by the standards of the rest of the country.
Oh, yeah.
And yet they were very progressive. So.
Very, very. It's been interesting to do research on it because. All right, any other questions? Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.